Okay, great to see everyone. Thank you all for coming and welcome. I'm Mark Wallum. I'm ALBA's Executive Director. And on behalf of ALBA, I'd like to welcome you to this book talk featuring the book Lorca After Life by Noël Valis. I'll begin with just a few remarks and then we'll turn it over to Noël and Jeffrey to begin the conversation. And we'll be looking forward to your questions as well. We expect this event to last about 1 hour. This event is being recorded and will be posted for viewing on our YouTube channel shortly after the event concludes. If you do not wish to be seen, we suggest you turn off your video function. This event is part of the Perry Rosenstein Cultural Series, which ALBA is sponsoring in honor of the late humanitarian and philanthropist. Perry died in 2020 at the age of 94, but his legacy lives on in the Puffin Foundation, which he founded, and through us at ALBA due to his generosity. The Puffin Foundation remains today one of ALBA's most generous donors. Their generosity, as well as yours, makes these programs possible. This event is also a Pride Month event, the second annual Pride event that ALBA has conducted. While Lorca was a complex and multi-layered figure, as Noël's book affirms, his sexual identity played a major role in his life, his death, and his legacy. ALBA is determined to continue our advocacy and openness in the face of fascist threats against the LGBT community. As a gay man who came out in the 1970s, I've seen incredible progress in my lifetime. But I am also deeply concerned by the regressive actions being taken across the country against our community. We must remain vigilant, stand strong, and be out and about as never before. I want to thank our partners in this program, the University of West Georgia School of the Arts, Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies of Yale University, and the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, also of Yale University. We are very honored to have Noël Valis as our special guest. She has been a longtime friend of ALBA, and we appreciate her cooperation and collaboration on this event. She will be introduced in just a minute. At this time, I'd like to thank and introduce Jeffrey Zamostny, who will engage Noël in a discussion of her book and related topics. Jeffrey is a professor of Spanish and director of the Office of Undergraduate Research at the University of West Georgia. His research examines questions of gender, sexuality, celebrity, and fandom in early 20th century Spain. He is a co-editor with Susan Larson of Kiosk Literature of Silver Age Spain, Modernity and Mass Culture, and with Dolores Romero Lopez of Towards the Digital Cultural History of the Other Silver Age Spain. He also translated Elena Fortune's novel, Hidden Path. So thank you once again to all of you for being here. Thank you to Noël and Jeffrey. We look forward to the presentation and to a lively discussion. Jeffrey, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you to ALBA for organizing this talk and to everyone for attending. So in just a few moments, Noël and I will dialogue about her book, Lorca After Life. We invite you to type any questions into the chat. We will have a Q&A session after the conversation, and you'll be invited to either ask the question live or someone can read it for you. So it's my pleasure to introduce Noël Valis. She teaches at Yale University and writes on modern Spanish literature, culture, and history, with books on the Spanish Civil War, bad taste and class in modern Spain, and religion and literature. She's the author of 28 books, including Sacred Realism, Religion and the Imagination in Modern Spanish Narrative, Teaching Representations of the Spanish Civil War, and The Culture of Cursilería, Bad Taste, Kitsch, and Class in Modern Spain. She's also written a book of poetry, My House Remembers Me, a novella, The Labor of Longing, and translations of the poetry of Noni Venegas. And on a more personal note, I've been reading Professor Valis's scholarship for over 2 decades, and I think her early work on the 19th century writer Leopoldo Alas, Clarín, was one of the reasons I got into Hispanism in the first place. So thank you so much for that, Professor Valis. So I just wanted to start off asking you, we have this book, Lorca After Life. It's a major project. What motivated you to take on this book? And can you talk to us a little bit about the title? Why Lorca After Life?
Good question. First, I also want to thank ALBA and Mark and Dennis and everyone at ALBA for having this, and to thank Jeff for being so gracious as to be my partner in conversation here for these few minutes, and to thank all of you who are here. So I never thought I would write a book on Federico García Lorca. This was as much a surprise to me as probably to some other people who had been laboring and wonderfully on the work and figure of Lorca for decades. I do not consider myself a Lorca scholar. I certainly was not labeled as such when I started to work on this book, but over a period of 10 or more years, because it took me a long time to write the book, I learned an enormous amount, not only about Lorca, but about the people who are so devoted to this man and to his work. And it is an extraordinary amount of scholarship that has been produced on Federico. As I said, I never thought I would write this book. But many years ago, a colleague of mine at Yale, with whom I am on very good terms, he's a friend of mine, we got into a kind of a friendly argument, one we had had before, over the question of studying canonical versus non-canonical writers. And his view was that you should only look at canonical writers, the big guys, right? Lorca, Cervantes, Borges, for example, or Whitman, Shakespeare, Milton in other cultures. Those are the only people you should look at. The rest didn't matter. Well, I've always been of the view that we should be looking at everything. And I have always devoted my life to both the canonical and the non-canonical, the marginalized figures in the literature and history, in this case of Spain in particular. And so we argued over this without convincing the other of our viewpoint. And at the very end, he said, "Why don't you write a book on Lorca?" Well, I didn't take him up on the offer, but eventually, I started to think about it. I had always been teaching a course on Lorca, and I still do, and I love his work. It was one of the first things I ever read in Spanish, and this was something that I had been living with for a long time. I had done a little bit of work on a particular play of his, but that was a while ago, and it was a very small project in comparison to this. So I felt very exhilarated about the thought of doing this, but I had absolutely no idea about what I might write. I had no thesis. I had no major theme. So I was exhilarated about the thought of it, but it was also extraordinarily daunting. First of all, because there has been so much written on Lorca, and there continues to be so much written on him. But then I began to realize, well, there is something that I've always found fascinating, and it is the question of his fame, his celebrity. It took me a long while, though, before I even got to that point, let alone trying to hone in on what I meant by that, and how I was going to approach this whole subject of celebrity or fame in the case of Lorca. But once I did, then I realized that there was something else that had always fascinated me as well, and I'm not the only one, which was gay Lorca, and these are naturally connected, especially when we look at Lorca from our point of view, from our time frame, because Lorca now is a gay icon. And he's a gay icon not only in Spain, but globally. So this is part of his iconicity, is part of his fame. So that led me obviously to that. But before you can get to his iconicity as his gay iconicity, you have to pass through his death. You have to pass through his death. So half the book has to do with that, and the other half has to do with gay Lorca. And yes, you wanted to.
Where the title comes in a bit, right?
Yes.
The Lorca After Life. So
Yeah.
I guess talking a little bit more about the death, how did Lorca's death during the Spanish Civil War play into the many different afterlives of Lorca that you look at in the book?
Enormously. And of course, I'm not the first person to have noticed this. Enormously. And the title, and it was a good question asked, Lorca, why Lorca After Life? Afterlife has obviously different kinds of meanings. Literally afterlife, after his death, obviously, right? I mean, starting with his death. But also, there's this notion of a Lorca as being a figure that people go after. That is to say, that they pursue both his work and his persona, the figure of Lorca. So you see this even today. I mean, there's an extraordinary obsession with Lorca, for example. Think of the biographer, Gibson, who's written so much about Lorca. And you could call this a kind of quest on the part of Gibson. And as I say, I don't think he's the only one, but I think he's the most striking of this kind of obsession with Lorca. So people have gone, figuratively speaking, after Lorca as well, right? And then you have the notion, I don't necessarily speak about this that much in the book, but it's kind of implicit. Lorca was a larger than life figure. He was enormously charismatic, as almost everyone has written about this. And so you have this extraordinarily energetic figure who went after life himself, right? Who pursued life with a zest, with an extraordinary zest. And so that and as well as other meanings figure into the title. And that's also why I chose that photograph, because it shows Lorca at the age of 25 or 26. And although you can find other photographs with him smiling, this one, he is so exuberant, right? Yeah. And he's practically elevated, right, in off the ground, you know. So I thought it was a perfect expression as well of the title, Lorca After Life. So the death, you ask about the death and how that figures into what we really have to call the myth of Lorca as well, because when you're talking about his death, you're talking about both the realities and the myths of Federico García Lorca. And although he had gained quite a bit of celebrity in life, the really global, worldwide fame that he attained comes after his death. The death was a shock not only within Spain, but reverberated far beyond the frontiers of Spain, and continues to do so. So it fostered as well an enormous amount of differing views, differing images of Lorca, to the point where you don't have just one Lorca, you have multiple Lorcas. And the death, I think, was in this, and it may seem like an odd term, but it was transformative in that sense. And I think that you can't separate that knowledge of his assassination from his fame, his posthumous fame at all. Yeah.
One of the things that was just so striking to me about the book is that Lorca's death, there were reactions and not just on the left, kind of envisioning him as a sort of martyr for the Republic, potentially, but also on the right. And as you characterize it, an almost schizophrenic discourse about Lorca's assassination on the right, and even among the Spanish fascist party, the Falange. Could you talk a little bit about how his image was sort of mobilized by different political groups after the assassination?
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, I mean, certainly on the Republican side, he was very quickly characterized as a martyr, a martyr to the Republican cause. And I think of, for example, some of the imagery that was used to foster this image of martyrdom. And one of the images was to connect Lorca very intimately and powerfully to the image of the Spanish earth, the Spanish earth. And that immediately, of course, also connects us with some of the kinds of imagery that you also saw during the war, during the Civil War, when the Republican cause in particular was intimately and strongly tied to the idea of the Spanish earth. And all you have to think about is Joris Ivens, the Hemingway Joris Ivens film, The Spanish Earth. That's a good example. But you see this also in the way that Lorca was transformed into this Republican martyr, into the symbol of the Second Republic, for example. The one thing that you don't see is at that time is Lorca as a gay martyr. that comes much later. That is not something that you're going to see in the 1930s, or even in the 1940s or the 1950s. You have to really wait till much more recently. But at the same time, as you know, there were a few on the right who also tried to bring Lorca into the fold of the right, which I have found absolutely fascinating. I mean, it's totally unconvincing, but I think it's something worth looking at. In some cases, I don't think they knew him, but they tried to turn him into a kind of a phalangist or a nationalist martyr to imperial Spain, for example. And they also used similar imagery that the Republican side had used and continued to use for quite some time afterward. So you've got that, and you've also got some of Lorca's friends, because he had friends all across the political spectrum. You have some of his friends on the right who espoused the cause of the Nationalists, who were very conflicted, obviously, because they loved Lorca, they loved his work, but they were on the other side. So they had to work especially hard, I think, to bring Lorca into the nationalist fold. I don't think any of them succeeded in that, because it simply doesn't have a historical, realistic foundation, in fact, right? But it is fascinating to see it. And I think one of the most interesting cases was Roy Campbell. Roy Campbell, who was a South African poet and one of the few writers and artists who espoused, who supported the Nationalists. And he wrote some really awful lines about Lorca, referring in form of insult, basically, to Lorca as a homosexual, for example. I mean, really, really beyond the pale kind of stuff. But at the same time, he translated a huge amount of his poetry. So go figure, right? How do you reconcile, this attack on Lorca as gay or a Republican martyr as well, and at the same time translating huge amounts of his poetry, and also writing a short book, an essay, that also indicates, shows very clearly that Campbell thought he was a wonderful writer.
Yeah, I think Roy Campbell is a good example of how you characterize that right-wing response to Lorca as sort of schizophrenic, almost bipolar, really. Well, returning to the left a little bit, we're talking about Lorca in an event sponsored by ALBA, right? The Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives. So I was wondering, is there any connection between Lorca, his work, and the volunteers?
That's a good question. Of course, Lorca wouldn't have lived long enough to have known about the brigades or the volunteers. And I don't have any statistics to back any of this up, but my guess is that I suspect that a good number of the volunteers knew who Lorca was. And there's certainly some evidence of that. I remember reading a number of years back a really fascinating piece in The Volunteer, the ALBA publication, about a fellow who, a volunteer who wrote a letter on the back of a Civil War poster, in which he talks, among other things, about Lorca being the poet of the Spanish people and being much revered in all of Spain. And so I think, and I think he had a book of Lorca's poetry with him. By the way, there are also some indications that some on the right read his poetry in the trenches, so to speak, at the front, right? But overwhelmingly, of course, you had Lorca being read by the Republican side. There were also volunteers who ended up afterward, after the war, writing about Lorca. Edwin Rolfe, for example, wrote a splendid poem about Lorca. And then there was Lloyd Mallon. I've written about him separately, not in the book. An interesting case here, a volunteer who also ended up translating a number of Lorca's poems into English, and also wrote one of the first pieces, a kind of a quasi-fictionalized account of of Lorca's last moments, imagining the death, for an American audience, and which had some impact, I think, in shaping this kind of mythic image of Lorca as a martyr.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we're also talking about Lorca at a Pride event. And, you know,
Yes.
with titles like Ode to Walt Whitman, Sonetos del Amor Oscuro, it does seem like there's a pretty complicated relationship between Lorca and the concept of gay pride. So how would you talk about that? Why is it appropriate to talk about this book in the context of a Pride event?
I think I can't think of any moment when it wouldn't be appropriate to talk about Lorca. I think this question also is, and certainly the question of Lorca as gay is an extraordinarily important one. Gay pride, though, and we talked about this a bit when we were discussing how we were going to have our conversation. It's a tricky question because to some degree it is anachronistic, and it just didn't exist obviously in Lorca's day. And Lorca was never out. There were very few gays in Spain who were actually out of the closet, and Lorca was not out. So the question would be, and I have no answer for this, can we talk about gay pride if you're still in the closet? I don't know. I don't know if is there an answer to that, or do we talk about it and wonder, right? I don't know. But it seems to me that it would be difficult, I think, to transfer this very contemporary notion of gay pride to his time. He was very conflicted in some ways. In other ways, I would say probably as he was growing older, there were indications that he was growing more comfortable in being who he was. There is a letter that he wrote to a close friend of his, in which he talks about writing The Public, a very difficult play with a homosexual theme to it. And in which he talks about how happy he was that he was approaching this theme of homosexuality. And I think it may be the only time when he actually wrote the word homosexual anywhere. Who knows, what he would have done afterward if he had survived the war. We don't know. But so I think it might be actually more fruitful to think about what it meant to be gay, in the 1920s and 30s in Spain.
Yeah, and your book really,
yeah.
I mean, your book really presents kind of a whole subculture that was emerging in Madrid and Barcelona, major cities at the time, that people haven't been looking at and haven't been talking about until quite recently. Can you talk about, whether Lorca had any connection to any of that, or what did that look like at the time?
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating subject, and really rich material. I was just astounded at the things that I discovered that I had no idea. Now, other people have been working on this question in this period of time, and I have obviously benefited tremendously from their research. But at the same time, I think one of the things that we're beginning to understand more clearly is that this culture was not as invisible as we used to think it was. And this is despite the fact that an awful lot of records have been lost or were destroyed because of the war and the dictatorship. this is despite that, and the deaths of so many people and the loss of all this witnessing, let us say, from the period. Despite that, we can find a lot of indications in literature and non-literature, non-literary sources, examples of how, if they weren't coming out of the closet, they certainly were starting to what is the word I'm looking for? To make themselves known. And in that sense, I think that's a good thing to be talking about during Pride Month.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, a really good thing to understand. It was, of course, very difficult to be gay in Spain, but it was difficult everywhere. Spain was not an exception in that regard. And in fact, just before the Second Republic, we'll recall that the Primo de Rivera dictatorship had basically criminalized homosexuality, and there was a law on the books which made it even more difficult. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Not only the laws, but of course, even more so, the social constraints that Lorca and other gay writers and just plain ordinary people had to live with. But I think the fact that he wrote a poem like the Ode to Walt Whitman, it is extraordinary. And I'm not the only one, obviously, to see that. It is, of course, a deeply, deeply conflicted poem. You can see the ambivalence of the poetic voice, not knowing how to deal with the various manifestations of homosexuality that he saw. Walt Whitman is of course, the gay of all gays, right? The gay icon of all gay icons. And in part, Lorca is known as a gay icon because of this poem to Walt Whitman, who is, in my view, the biggest gay icon of all in this sense. But in the poem, you also have these other gays, and he uses what is, of course, a term of insult, maricas. And he has a hard time dealing with the presence of another kind of homosexuality, which is largely urban in his description of it.
One of the things that you write about in the book, kind of moving past Lorca's own time period, is the way he's been talked about by so many other writers closer to our time, including gay writers, many of whom really have to grapple with that very kind of almost contradictory, very tense, conflicted poem, Ode to Walt Whitman. Could you talk about maybe one other writer that you found who's written about Lorca more recently and contributed to kind of his ongoing celebrity?
Yeah, and I think among others, I mean, there's quite a few. There's a Colombian-American poet named Jaime Manrique, who's written about Lorca in the form of a poem and also a memoir called Eminent Maricones, which is a fascinating little book. It is kind of memoir and essay combined, in hybrid form. And the poem that he wrote is really about a one-night stand that another writer, Eduard Roditi, had with Lorca in Paris when Lorca was on his way to New York in 1929. And here you can see in the poem, you can see how all these issues kind of come together in such an interesting way. You've got the question of Lorca as gay. You've got the question of his celebrity, of his fame, because this poem would not make any sense if you weren't understanding it from the position of many decades later, seeing Lorca as someone, as a gay person, whereas Roditi, when he met him in Paris, he only knew this was a guy named Federico, right? At least that's what he claims. And then you also have it kind of in the background, without it really being spoken of very much, but it was always there, the war, the assassination.
Yeah.
And they all come together.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I know we have a lot of great questions in the chat. Before we get to a couple questions, I wanted to ask you one more, and that is, what conclusions do you want readers to take away from your book? If there's one or two biggest takeaways that you'd like people to leave the book with.
Well, we didn't really get a chance much to talk about this, although you mentioned it. Yeah, about the notion of communities around Lorca. And one of the things I wanted to do, there were a number of things I wanted to do, but one of the things I wanted to do was to understand that fame is a crowded room. You know, we think of a celebrity as an individual, and of course that is true. And so we tend to focus on the individual, but you can't understand fame without all the people and the communities around this particular person. And so what I looked at was, for example, Lorca as a people's poet. I looked at Lorca as a gay icon. I looked at Lorca as a member of the Dead Poets Society, just to give some examples. And these are all, you could call this a kind of a communal identity, which not only defines Lorca to some degree, the figure of Lorca, but also defines those communities as well. It's a kind of a to and fro, you know, there's a real dynamic going on between them. And the other thing, so that is one of the things that I hope that people will take away from this, that his fame is both individual and communal. And then another thing that I found that was for me a wonderful discovery was this notion of the marvelous. Because Lorca was marvelous. I mean, he was absolutely marvelous, the figure and the work. And what I wanted to bring out as well was the notion that Lorca as a modern writer, as a modern figure, is also an expression of the marvelous. And that one of the things that we have tended to forget, because we see all the awful things that have happened in the 20th century, is also all the wondrous things that the 20th century, that modernity represented. And interestingly enough, one of the things that I found to be a real revelation was the way homosexuality was treated, not by all, obviously, but by a significant number of both gay and non-gay, but especially other gay writers, as something marvelous. So that is one of the things that I think that I hope that people would be interested in.
Thank you so much, Professor Valis. I know we
Please,
have a
Noël.
lot of questions in the chat. I'm going to hand it over to Dennis to maybe moderate some questions.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Jeffrey, for that. Yes, my name is Dennis Meany. I'm with the executive assistant here at ALBA. I've been recording all of the questions everybody here has been putting into the chat, and I really appreciate that. So the way we usually handle this is I've chosen some of your questions. I will be calling on you and allowing you to unmute yourself to ask the panel themselves the questions. If you don't feel comfortable being on camera and asking the questions, that's fine as well. And I'll ask the question myself. I'll ask the question of the panelists. So thank you. We're going to begin with Erica Sutherland. I believe you had a question about Lorca's iconity. So if you'd like to ask your question, you can go ahead and do so now.
Hi there, thank you. And hello, Noël Valis, one of my very favorite professors and scholars. My question has to do with Lorca and the Gypsies and the Gitanos, and how there's almost that second layer of iconicity, in that in many ways he's been conflated with that which is Gitano in southern Spain. But in other ways, his personal life history represents really a rejection of that. Some of his early essays are fairly harshly anti-Gitano. And even professionally, he really didn't hang with the Gitanos. And yet, that is one of the relationships that possibly equal to the relationship with his homosexuality, is the one that is most raised up in popular culture. Mm-hmm. And I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you. And it's lovely to see you, Erica. This is one of the advantages of Zoom, isn't it? Yes, this has certainly been one of the major images that popularized about Federico. I think we have to put him in his context, right? And Lorca, overall, I would say, you know, when his book, Gypsy Ballads, came out and was a huge success, this is especially the time then when people started to see him as a gypsy poet. And this annoyed him because he's a writer above all else, right? And as he wrote in a couple of letters to friends, he said, well, look, this is a theme, nothing else. I'm writing about gypsies and it's a literary theme. And I can understand that point of view. Also, he wasn't gypsy himself, which is something that many people tend not to realize, that because this image, this stereotype of him being so closely connected to the gypsies has created, I think, a kind of a false image, and that, I think, annoyed him no end. One could interpret that, I suppose, in a negative way. On the other hand, what did he do with gypsy ballads? He did something extraordinary. He took a traditional form, the ballad, the romance, which is already a wonderful contribution to world literature from Spain. And he used avant-garde techniques and imagery to not only revitalize the ballad form, but also to give us an image of the gypsy, which is at once literary and imaginative, deeply imaginative, but also social. And I think this is one of the things that is perhaps the most significant thing to take away concerning Lorca's connection and relation with the gypsies, because those poems, as well as being wonderful works of art, are also social critiques of the persecution of gypsies. And he had also wrote in other instances about his close identification and sympathy toward marginalized groups, including the gypsies, obviously. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Erica, and thank you, Noël. I think maybe we can go to next. Nicole Henneres had a question regarding Lorca being quote unquote out. Nicole, if you'd like to ask your question now, you can go ahead and do so.
Hi, Ms. Hennares.
Oh,
Nicole
sorry.
Hennares. Don't worry. So I was wondering about how you define out, because I think that we, especially where I live in San Francisco, think of the term out in 2023 as something very different than being out in 1929 when he wrote Ode to Walt Whitman. I feel like Ode to Walt Whitman is a catalog of how homophobia is embedded into the Spanish language, and how he struggled even being able to out himself, and his appreciation and love for Walt Whitman is being able to express himself with language that only in Spanish is self-loathing. And I feel like Ode to Walt Whitman was a turning point in his poetry that led him not only to write Play and Theory of Duende, where he stood before an audience in Argentina and said, and with Neruda, who said, ladies, and Lorca went, and gentlemen, which is a very loaded thing. And then, but that Ode to Walt Whitman is a turning point where he outs himself. He says, I'm American, I'm, all these words for himself, and that he looks at Walt Whitman as this symbol of being able to find love for himself and express love for his homosexuality and his body without shame. And we see that built upon in Supermarket in California by Allen Ginsberg. And Lil Nas X, Montero. That is a song that is absolutely in dialogue with Ode to Walt Whitman. And being from Hispanic culture and how homosexuality has always been part of our culture, but the language for it, how do we find our language for it? Is a good, really difficult.
This is a great question. And connecting this with the understanding of what we mean by out. I was thinking, and I think in a way you're right. You could say that that the Ode to Walt Whitman is a kind of coming out. On the other hand, I was actually referring to the notion of being out in society, and which is perhaps a more conventional understanding of out, but that was the context from which I was speaking. If we think about the poem, yeah, there is this, there's, how to say this, there's no doubt, you know, about what the subject matter is, right? But I do wonder, though, to what extent, and I like the idea that you bring up about struggling with language, struggling and how to express, and maybe this could be connected with the idea of pride as well, how to express, you know, what you know you are in a language which has not permitted you to do so up to that point. And I believe you're right about this, that it is a turning point. This poem is a turning point without a doubt. But on the other hand, I don't think any of that eliminates the conflicted self that is also very much on display in the poem. So we've got both of these things going on at the same time, don't we? I don't think that poem will ever be resolved. It'll never be pinned down.
Something that I love that you do in the book with the poem Ode to Walt Whitman and related to this question is you bring it into dialogue with, you know, a totally non-canonical work, Las Locas de Postín, The Posh Fairies, by Alvaro Retana, who was this very out, flamboyant figure at the time. And what the two works have in common is that they do both have this sort of enumeration, almost a catalog of kind of queer figures at the time. And the tone is extremely different, right? But it's interesting, you know, I think you mentioned in the book, Lorca and Retana are not generally mentioned in the same breath, but maybe there should be more, because they are, you know, they're navigating the types of language available to them to talk about homosexuality for sure.
That's a great point. They are navigating the language, and they're doing this at the same time, pretty much, even though Retana is a few years older. Las Locas de Postín, The Posh Fairies, would be a translation of the title. It's from 1919. It's prose. It's a novella basically, and all the characters are male, and all the characters are gay, and they all use feminine forms of dress. So and then there is this scene in the novel in which they go to a cabaret and see a drag performance, and the performer, who is actually a real life historical figure, a drag performer, calls out with different names that were used to indicate gay, fag, homosexual, you know, all these different terms, marica, apio. I mean, there are a whole bunch of them, some of which both writers, Lorca and Retana, use. Different context, you're right, a comic novel, but one with a serious underpinning, I think, at the same time. But which also shows how, you know, both of them turn around that language and use it to their own benefit in that sense. Yeah.
Thank you so much to Jeffrey, Noël, and Nicole for that discussion. Okay, moving on. I believe this actually question was asked by multiple people, but it is on kind of contemporary icons. Russell Tennyson, if you would like to ask your question, you can do so now.
Hi. Buenas tardes a todos. My question is there anybody in the contemporary scene that we could compare him to? I was teaching AP Spanish literature, and one of the things I try to impress upon my kids is there's somebody in contemporary society that if they took him out and executed him or murdered him at age 38 with the talent, the multi-talents, musician, poet, playwright, of Garcia Lorca. Is there anybody we can compare him to today?
In Spain?
Any necessarily?
Or anywhere? Gosh, oh, I don't know. Nobody comes to mind, quite frankly. Did you have someone that you were thinking about?
Well, I try to tell my kids, you know, that I don't know how well known he was worldwide at that time, but if they were to like execute Taylor Swift or Lady Gaga or somebody nowadays, what would it be like? What impact? I mean,
It would be huge.
have more fame, but I know that those that
Yeah.
knew him and knew his work were devastated by his death. But is there anybody in the contemporary scene that I mean, between
Honestly,
the flamenco, the music, the poet, I mean, the
Yeah.
multi-talents that he had.
I honestly, I can't think of anyone, but I'd be happy to entertain anybody else's suggestions if there is a figure that that even comes close, I think, to the impact that he had in life and afterward. I can't think of anyone. Jeff, is there anyone who comes to mind for you?
I'm seeing some things come in the chat.
Yes,
And
good. We got something here. Good.
my immediate response is that I can't think of anyone. And I wonder, and I dare to say, I wonder if it kind of reflects kind of the changing public status of poetry over time, over the course of the 20th century. You talk in the book about Lorca perhaps being one of the last in a long line of very public poets in Spain in particular. A poet very much linked to politics. And of course, there have been others since Lorca, but I'm not sure they've attained the same type of iconicity to this point.
Yeah.
Great. Oh, great. Well, thank you for that question, Russell. I think thank you, and thank you, Nicole. Added another Francisco Alarcon in the chat. And again, thank you everybody in the chat for adding some people they think are comparable contemporarily. Okay, so maybe we can move on to another question. This is a question from, hold on one second. Bruce Fine asked the question less so about Lorca and more about culture in Spain pre-Franco, queer culture. So Bruce, if you'd like to ask your question, you can go ahead and do so now. We could do our best to answer it if you'd like.
Sure. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Right. My wife and I and her son, we lived in Spain from 1980 to 1982, and I can remember going out down on the beach in Estepona, and there was a drag show, a flamenco show and a drag show at the same time, and I was quite stunned by this. This is a time, of course, when Spain was coming off of Franco's dictatorship, and it just seemed like the Spanish were just shrugging off the shackles of the past so rapidly. And I was just quite stunned by this. And I've always wanted to ask the question of the extent to which drag shows were part of Spanish culture historically. And I've heard some answers to that question already, I guess, but just wanted to, these things then come up again, don't they? Meaning, in this case, drag shows, expressions of queerness. It was fantastic material. It was, and with the flamenco guitar and everything, it was just stunning down on the beach. So I just wanted to share that experience, and I'm glad to get some historical perspective on it. And if there's any other comments, Noël, I would love to hear from you, and from anyone else too, of course.
Yeah,
Thank
no,
you.
this did exist. There were quite a few drag performers before the Franco dictatorship. Needless to say, this all disappeared, obviously, once that happened. But yeah, that was another thing that I found to be absolutely fascinating. The figure, in fact, the historic figure to which I was referring earlier in the Ritana novel was a guy named Edmond de Bris, which was a kind of a made-up name, his stage name, obviously. But there were quite a few of them. And there was a flourishing entertainment business in cabarets, music halls, and the like. This was especially noticeable during the World War I years into the 20s, and then, as I say, up to obviously the war and then the dictatorship. But yeah, they did exist, which is another example, I think, of what we were talking about, how, there was a certain amount of visibility. And this is an example of that.
Yeah. And one thing that I find interesting is, you mentioned the 80s. I think some figures of the transition, Pedro Almodóvar, some of the novísimos, the poets of the late 60s and 70s, Ocaña, the drag performer, I suspect that they were at least somewhat aware of what was going on in the 20s and 30s. Almodóvar has references to figures dating back prior to him, maybe not to the 20s and 30s, but Sara Montiel, who certainly became later on folded into that sort of couple culture and even drag scene. And so I do think the war broke a lot of things, but there were some continuities as well. And I just wanted, this question made me think of perhaps a good response to the previous question, or at least a response to the previous question. But, it may be too bold to compare Federico García Lorca and RuPaul. But I think if RuPaul were assassinated today, I mean, he certainly has achieved some sort of iconicity, and it does extend into Spain with RuPaul's Drag Race España, which actually, if you watch it, has some very interesting historical references to the 20s and 30s, and certainly sort of aesthetic, perhaps, that could be compared to Lorca and some of the Andalusianism of Lorca's work. So that could be a response.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Ocaña references Lorca, by the way. Ocaña, who was one of the figures that Jeff just mentioned, actually performed some of Lorca as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Bruce, for that great question. Okay, we have another question from Carla Hagen, who had asked a question about Lorca and Dali. Carla, if you'd like to ask your question, you can do so now.
Certainly. So it seemed that it was well known, at least among their immediate circle, that Dali and Lorca were lovers for at least 2 years. It was a lengthy relationship, and that the breakup caused Lorca a great deal of distress and maybe even triggered his trip to the United States. His family was worried about how depressed he was. So was that something that was only known in, that little circle, Buñuel and the other people at Libre Enseñanza, or was that kind of known in, say, society in Madrid?
Good question. But actually, the relationship between Dali and Lorca is really complicated. And there's a lot there that we really don't know. I think to my mind, there's no doubt that Lorca was in love with Dali. That Dali had strong feelings toward him, but Dali had there's no other way of saying it, such a screwed up sexuality because he didn't understand himself, I think, in that regard, that I don't think he was capable of fully expressing himself to Lorca or to anyone else for that matter. So we don't really know, to what degree, and to what extent that relationship might have been physical. It has been said that there was an attempt on the part of Lorca to engage in lovemaking with Dali, but that it didn't work out. I have no idea how true any of this is, but it was a very complicated relationship. And yes, it certainly caused some strain and emotional distress. The real distress that Lorca felt just before he left for New York in 1929 was with a relationship he was having with a sculptor named Emilio Aladren. And that they had broken off the relationship. And that was a real relationship. And he was, it was a real emotional crisis for him at that point. Yeah.
Great. Again, Carla, thank you for that question. Okay, I think, well, we're coming up sort of on time. I don't know if if Jeffrey, maybe you'd like to close with a question if you have anything left, or okay. If there's anyone in the chat right now who'd like to ask one question, you can get one more in before we have to wrap up. So I'm watching you there. Okay.
Well, that's good. I will just step in here, and I think to thank again everyone for coming, and maybe have a round of virtual applause for Noël and Jeffrey, and thank you all so much. And please, if you don't have the book, please do consider getting it. I just have found it a fascinating read. It's multi-layered and very, very, very interesting. So again, thank you all for coming, and please note August 23rd is a film screening. We're going to have a film screening of our board member Peter Miller's Sacco and Vanzetti. So it is the, I think, 96th anniversary of their tragic execution. And the film is a great documentary that deals with, you know, the injustices that were visited upon them, and then that execution on the 23rd. So please mark your calendars for that. And also, of course, watch your emails and our socials for ALBA news. And please consider a donation, as always. Thank you again very, very much. Happy Pride, everyone.
Thank